Hey everybody, welcome back. Good morning. So good to see you guys. This is Chapman Intro to Philosophy, Friday, April 17th, and we're going to get started at 10 a.m. This is 10 to 10:50 class. We have a little bit more info to go over on the subject of time and the metaphysics of time. We have kind of a fun lecture today that does explore some of the weird paradoxes of time travel. So that's the goal, and you guys just get comfortable, get ready, and hopefully you're all doing well and staying healthy. And that's about it. Welcome back. Good morning, Victoria. How are you? Good to see you. Anybody else, of course, if you want to just chime in and drop a comment or question, anything, it's always welcome. Hey, William, good to see you there. So just hang in there, and 3 minutes we'll be underway. Hey, Jordan. Brian, yeah, so office hours at this point, they're kind of by appointment, but I'm happy to do it, of course. So if you want, let's talk by email, Brian, and we can set up a time for a Skype call or anything else, So if you have questions that you would like me to answer in a written way, you can always send me those and I can respond through email. If you want to have a little bit more dialogue and verbal interaction, then yes, let's do a Skype call for anybody. The offer's on the table. So let me know, and we can set that up. Hey, Kaylee, good to see you too. Good morning. Okay, yeah, no problem. Thanks for your question. Have to stay hydrated. Okay. All right, we're getting close, just about a minute. Let everybody take a few seconds to arrive. Cool. Hey, hi Lily, happy Friday. TGIF. Still nice to have the weekend, even though the days kind of all just blur together now, right? Don't they? But I still like the weekends, yes. I have a pretty normal schedule still, I guess, and probably the same with you guys when it comes to being a teacher or a student. Hey, Annie, good to see you too. Hey, Jessica. All right, well, I guess, we're relatively close to 10 a.m., so I'm going to go on and get going with you guys. Welcome back. Good morning to everybody. Good to see you guys. So anyway, yeah, it's all about time. We've been speaking about this new topic for the past few meetings. Let me just give you a quick recap of what's led us to this point, and then we'll move on in the notes on one more author. Then that'll wrap up our discussions of time. And when we return on Monday, we'll be looking at another subject in the class, which is the philosophy of mind. So beginning with Einstein, Albert Einstein is really well known for revolutionizing the contemporary modern understanding of space and time. Before him, according to Newton, space and time were not linked together. They were independent of each other. So the belief was that if objects are moving around quickly or slowly in space, or if one object's moving fast and another's not as fast or at rest, this would have no effect at all on the way that time is passing, because time didn't have anything to do with the events occurring in space and how fast or slow they're moving relative to each other. But Einstein showed this is not true. The time and space are linked together, and the degree of velocity that one frame of reference has relative to others can in fact change the rate of time's passage for those different observers in the two reference frames. So he gave the example of lightning strikes, and I'll just run through that quickly. He said, suppose there are two lightning strikes that occur along two positions of a railway, A and B. Suppose they were simultaneous. Question, what does this mean? He says, you can't just give a weak, non-specific answer like, it's just same time as. What he's asking for is something a little more detailed. He wants there to be the means to conduct an experiment, to test whether the two lightning strikes were simultaneous or not. Because if we don't know how to test for it, then we really don't know what we're saying when we call them simultaneous. So he says, let's figure out how to test this proposition that they're simultaneous. So here's his method of testing it. He says, let's designate a midpoint that's bisecting the line segment A to B, take the length from A to B, find the midpoint, and put one observer standing at that midpoint motionless. Now, if this motionless observer who's standing at M sees the two lightning bolts at once from his perspective, they would be simultaneous relative to him. But we have to make one additional assumption, and that is that the speed of light is fixed and constant. So if the speed of light from A to M is the same as the speed of light from B to M, then given the fact that they've arrived at M at the same time, have traveled the same distance, and have moved at the same velocity, we can thus deduce that they were departing from their origin points A and B at the same time. In other words, simultaneous. But it gets weird, because if we take a second observer and we place this observer on a moving train that's being carried in the direction of B away from A, if this individual with constant velocity V surpasses the midpoint of A and B and conducts an observation of the two lightning bolts as he traverses the midpoint, whilst the other person standing still at M conducts his own observation, the second observer will not see the two lightning strikes happening at simultaneous moments. And the reason is because given that he's moving in the direction of B, away from A, and given that he is now covering past the midpoint, the two different light rays that are going to have to reach his eyes for him to see those events cannot possibly reach the eye at the same moment, because there are asymmetrical distances now involved. There's a shorter length between his body and B, and a longer length between his body and A. Therefore, if the two light signals travel at the same velocity, if they're moving different distances at that velocity, they cannot reach the target at the same point in time. So he'll see B and then A. And to even add a further layer of interesting intrigue, if there was a third observer who's going the opposite direction towards A away from B, if he passed midpoint M double prime and all three of the observers were momentarily aligned on that midpoint, we would see the two observers moving in opposite directions zoom past the midpoint with velocity V in the other direction. The third observer then would see A happening first, and then subsequently after that B. And therefore the two events A and B, the two lightning bolts, cannot be claimed with any objective fact to be either simultaneous or non-simultaneous. It really is just relative to the state of motion and perspective of the observer relative to other observers in space. So very puzzling and bizarre, and it has deep and far-reaching implications, because if, for example, a moment that one person judges to be in the future could be seen as having already happened in the past relative to a different possible observer, then that means there's no objective fact about whether it actually was in the future or in the past. So we thus must grant the reality of events that you would have taken to be not real yet because they don't yet exist. So thus all moments of space-time are equally real, not just the one that you call the present. And after that, we expanded on his work by discussing the concept of time dilation, and we used the case of the light clock to display that concept. If you have two light clocks and one is accelerating quickly and the other one is at rest, then the one that's accelerating more fast will elapse fewer seconds, and therefore it ages slower than the one that remains at rest relative to the one that remains at rest. So objects that are in one reference frame moving quickly are passing through time slower than objects in another reference frame that are moving less quickly or that are at rest. And that also kind of leads to the twins paradox, where you imagine scenarios in which two people of identical age are moving at different velocities and therefore achieve different ages at the conclusion of the one traveler's motion. And then we looked at Ted Sider. So Ted Sider just tries to expand on this by discussing the puzzles and paradoxes that arise when you start thinking about time. He says we should investigate this, even though we normally take it for granted, because once you analyze time in depth, the ordinary concept of it starts to break down a little bit. And why does it break down? Because we often say that time moves. There are many common phrases and expressions that give voice to that. Time is flying, time is passing, time is marching on, time waits for nobody. All these common sayings indicate that deeply rooted in our thinking of time is that it somehow moves. But he says this is puzzling to explain, because what are we saying when we say time moves? Think about the concept of motion itself. For a thing to move through space at all, it has to be at different places at different times. Like if my hand is moving from this side of the whiteboard to the other, it had to be at different places, each of the places along its path of travel at the different times that passed as the hand moved. This was displayed in the article by a diagram showing a bus or train that departs from Boston and ultimately arrives in Washington, D.C. It makes its journey from point A to B by being in all these different intermediate locations at different times as it makes its trip. If the train had stayed in the station the whole time, then it didn't move. So for a thing to move, it has to be at different places at different times. Therefore, if time itself moves, it would have to, it seems, be that time is moving by being in different places at different times. And now we've gone in a circle, trying to define the movement of time with reference to time itself, and therefore no non-circular explanation has been given. Another attempt was to say maybe time moves by the present moment moving, right? So like earlier, just now, 10 a.m. was present when this lecture started. Now that's the past, and it's 10:08 pretty much. That's the present moment. And later on, when this class is over, 10:50 will be the present moment. So is it the present moment moving its position that accounts for the idea of time moving? He says, although this is another noble attempt to explain this, it still does not work, because for the present moment to move, it would again have to be at different positions at different times. So therefore, we're still relying on the notion of time to give any kind of justified definition of what it is for it to move. So he thinks instead, let's just go in a different direction. Another alternative to this whole problem is to say, wait a minute, there's no such thing as time moving. If we accept the theory of space-time from Einstein, then that allows us to avoid this problem, because according to that theory, there's no movement in time. There's just the collection of all events contained within space-time, and they're all equally real. The past, future, present, they're all just as real as one another. There's no coming into being, going out of being. There's just all the moments collected in the big space-time framework. And on that view, problem solved, because there's no movement to explain. But to understand space-time theory, you got to kind of think about these space-time diagrams. So that's where he goes next. If we're going to, hold this theory and see it as valuable because it allows us to avoid this puzzle, then what's the theory really say about us and how we exist in space-time? So he displays these space-time diagrams, which show the existence of an object over its entire span of timeline. And on that description, what we have are both spatial and temporal parts. Spatial part of an object is its physical body parts. In your case, head, arms, torso, legs, feet, whatever. In the case of this table, tabletop, legs of the table, etc. So objects have spatial parts like those, and that's why they have volume and mass. But they also, according to the theory of space-time, have temporal parts. Now, a temporal part of an object is just that object at an individual moment of time. And so there's one temporal part of you for each moment that you do exist. There's one temporal part of you watching this lecture right now, and now another, because with each new moment, it's another temporal part in the sequence of time that spans from the individual's initiation to the termination of their existence. And these temporal parts are claimed to be just as real as your physical body parts are. So you're already fully existent in the sense that all of your temporal parts are real, including the past and future parts, but you only experience the present one at a time. So then he talked about three similarities between space and time that are licensed by the space-time theory. When you embrace the space-time theory, you have to reconceptualize time a little bit and think of it as having more in common with space than you normally think. And the three similarities, that's kind of where we ran out of time last meeting. So the first one was, in terms of reality, space and time are similar. What that means is that the distance away from you in space doesn't affect how real an object is. So like, your hand is right here in front of you. In my case, my watch is right here. It's on my wrist. It's certainly real. But even if I took it off and I threw it 100 miles away, it would still be real. Or if I sent it in a rocket and fired it over towards Mars, it would still be real. So it's not like distance and space affects the reality of something. It's not like only the things that are close to you, the observer, are real. The same is true of time, according to this claim. So events that are far away in time are just as real as the present moment you're experiencing now. So it's not like only the now exists. All the future points in time are just as real as this now, and just as well the past. So distance in space or time has no effect on how real things are. The second similarity was in terms of parts. So objects occupy space by having the spatial parts, and objects occupy time by having those temporal parts. And the third similarity between space and time mentioned was in terms of the words here and now. Both of those words are relative terms. Here is a spatial term, now is a temporal term. But they're similar because there's no objective reference to either. Where is here at? It's just wherever the speaker is who uses the word. It's the space surrounding the speaker. Therefore, it's relative. When is now? Now is not a single moment. It's whenever a speaker speaks the word now. So people saying, now it's 1920, 100 years ago, that was now relative to the space-time temporal part that spoke at that point. Me saying now it's 2020, that's true relative to this current temporal part of my being that is speaking now. And in 100 years, people saying now it's 2120. This is, again, a correct statement, but it's because now doesn't refer to only one moment of time. It refers to whatever time the person who speaks the word is speaking it at. Okay, so 3 similarities between space and time. The last little thing I wanted to clear up, or not clear up, but add to the discussion of Sider is this. He says, well, now I've given you the basic breakdown of the theory of space-time and its benefits and theoretical virtues, but a lot of people still just think it's too weird to be true. And so he says some people would just throw up their hands and say, I can't accept this because it's just too counterintuitive. For example, and he gives this quote where he says, here's what a critic of this might say. Past and future objects do not exist. The past is gone, and the future is not yet happened. Things do not have temporal parts. At any time, the whole object is there, not just a temporal part of it. There are no future or past parts left out. And now is not like here. The present moment is special, unlike the random bit of space around the speaker when they say the word here. So you might have these feelings that although there's some scientific evidence and some conceptual benefit to having the space-time theory, it's just wildly counterintuitive and contrary to everyday common sense. Well, he says another element of this type of criticism is that according to space-time theory, nothing really changes. And some people might find that to be very unintuitive and hard to comprehend. And nothing does change according to the theory in a sense, right? So like, say you get a haircut and you have long hair now, then you get the haircut and then the hair is short. A normal thing that anybody would probably say is, I've changed my hairstyle. But has the hairstyle changed according to space-time theory? Not so much. According to space-time theory, all the space-time temporal parts of the individual are fully laid out. And the one temporal part in that time sequence that has the long hair has always been at that point in the timeline. And the subsequent temporal part of the person that has the short hair after the haircut, that's also always been on the same timeline. So the whole timeline structure or space-time diagram has always had all those parts. And therefore you might say, has anything really changed? Not really. It's just that at the earlier time, this temporal part had long hair, and it always does. And at the later time, this other temporal part has shorter hair, but the individual temporal part has always just been sitting on that position in the timeline, and therefore the whole timeline as a whole hasn't really changed. Makes sense? Now, what Ted Sider says in response to this is that although that sounds a little bit weird and different, it's not actually so strange as to be a fatal objection to the theory. Basically, we can just reconceptualize what change means. In the space-time theory, what we normally think of as change gets redescribed as having qualitative difference of attributes among different temporal parts of the same object. So like if I lost a finger, God forbid, but if I did, then a temporal part of me after the injury would have not had the finger. But that temporal part in the sequence has always not had such a finger. Nonetheless, we could call it change by saying at time t1, there was a temporal part which had a finger. At time t n greater than 1 or t2, whatever, the other temporal part doesn't have it. And just this qualitative difference of attributes among the two different adjacent temporal parts is what we now call change. So it doesn't fully eliminate the way of thinking about change. It just forces us to reconsider what it means. It's not one and the same thing undergoing a change, but it's two parts of the same thing holding different qualities. Okay. Another objection, and this kind of now transitions and leads us into our author for today. So another objection that a man or woman of common sense might make is that according to space-time, time and space are very similar, right? But here's one thing about them that might not seem similar. In space, it seems like an object can move in any direction, forward, backward, diagonally, whatever. But you might say that is not the same with time, because in time, the direction of travel is in only one straight arrow forward, from past to future, and there's no way of doubling back. Furthermore, you could argue that events of the present and future can never affect events of the past, so there can't be backwards causation. You know, like, so if I, let me think of like forwards versus backwards causation, giving you an example. If I fire a basketball at a hoop, right, then you might say the conditions of my taking the shot causes the basket to go in. But it seems like it's impossible for it to work in the opposite direction. It's not like making a basket in the future can cause you to shoot it in the past or something like that. So basically another objection to this model is to say that it should be possible for there to be time travel and causation from future to past. And since we don't see that, then maybe there isn't really this common similarity between space and time. In reaction to that, Ted Sider says, time travel scenarios are actually not inconceivable. They may sound weird, bizarre, but they're not logically impossible. There are some consistent, well thought out time travel scenarios in which nothing happens, which is a logical contradiction. And therefore, the whole idea of time travel is actually something that is possible. That kind of builds into today's meeting, okay? So one last author on this subject, and that's David Lewis. David Lewis. So this is a great American philosopher who lived from 1941 until 2001. And he's one of my favorites, really. He's probably in my top 10 if I had to give one. And, you know, he's written on all kinds of interesting subjects: logic, metaphysics, philosophy of mind, epistemology. He's got a whole wealth of interesting material, and he's well known for kind of taking and staking out unique positions that are a little bit outside the mainstream of some people's beliefs in philosophy, but he always has very clear and detailed arguments to defend his points. So he's one of the greats, I believe, and in 1971 he gave a lecture on time travel, and he was pretty young at that point, just 30. In 1976 that lecture became a published paper, and it's kind of a well-known paper now, so that's what we're talking about. It's from 1976, and it's called The Paradoxes of Time Travel. Paradoxes of Time Travel, David Lewis, 1976. So just open my notes to that. So the main thesis of his paper is actually a pretty straightforward one. He's simply trying to make this case. Time travel is possible. It is not impossible. So he's trying to argue that time travel is logically conceivable. And he's basically having to defend against the argument that no, it's not possible. Some people might think there are paradoxes that are so deep when it comes to the whole thought of time travel that it could never happen and it's not theoretically even possible. But what David Lewis is making the case again in this paper is that that's not true. It is possible. So the weird, puzzling, paradoxical aspects of time travel scenarios, he wants to argue that those are just weird, but not actually totally impossible. So he takes us kind of on a tour through what might be seen as some of the main paradoxes and weird things about time travel, and he just tries to explain how, despite their weirdness, they don't point to it being logically impossible. All right, so to start off, he wants to just give a basic definition of time travel as he sees it. So he defines it as follows: time travel. A discrepancy between two different measurements of time. Discrepancy, difference, in other words, between two different measurements of time. Allow me to explain. So let's go into a possible situation where we have this guy. This guy walks into this cylinder. He's got a watch on his wrist. Say that when he walks into the cylinder on his watch, it says 10 a.m. Okay? And on his watch, he waits 5 minutes in the cylinder. So according to his watch, he spent 5 minutes in there. Let me just say, I don't know if I want to go with 5 minutes. Well, let's say 30 minutes. Okay? He exits from that machine after being in, or that device, whatever it is, after 30 minutes elapse on his watch. So then he gets out. Okay, now question. When he gets out of this machine, having spent 30 minutes inside, when he got in, it was 10 a.m. on his watch. Looking at his watch, watching it, just hanging out for half hour. Getting out of the machine, his watch says 10:30. Now, what if all the clocks that external clocks show, what if the time they all show is 10:30 when he gets out? Was that a time travel machine then? That's a simple question in a way. So what the question is this. If he gets out and all the other clocks, not just his wristwatch, but all the other clocks also say 10:30, did this man travel through time? Did he get into a time machine? If when he got in, it said 10 on his watch and on all the other watches, and he spent 30 minutes inside, emerged from it, and all the watches outside say 10:30. No, that was not time travel then. Good, Caesar, Jessica, and William. In that sense, it's not time travel. What happened in that case is he just walked into like an empty shipping container, spent 30 minutes in it, and then just got out. That's not time travel. Or if it is, then we're all time travelers in a very boring sense. I guess we're all time travelers in a way because we're all traveling from the past to the future at a steady rate of 1 hour per hour. Okay, so like I guess we've all traveled through time 24 minutes since the beginning of this lecture, from 10 a.m. to 10:24, and we'll travel another basically half of the class, 26 minutes, until we get to the end of this. But that's not the kind of time travel that is of interest, right, in all the science fiction scenarios and literature. It's not like people are interested in talking about time travel of just a common person's existence as they age and as they go through time. So if this is actually a time machine and not just a shipping container, then what should clocks say external to his watch when he gets out of the machine? Say that he goes to the future, and he goes 2 hours into the future, right? Then when he gets out of the machine, his watch will say 10:30. But all the external clocks should say what if you've made a 2-hour travel to the future? What should all external clocks say if his time in the cylinder was time travel towards 2 hours in the future? He'll get out. The watch on his wrist will say 10:30 because he spent 30 minutes relative to his own experience in the machine. But a 2-hour trip to the future, they should all show, I was going to say 12:30 to account for the fact that there's 2 hours plus the amount of time that he experienced in the machine. So basically you're correct though. So that would be like future time travel. If he was going to the past, then the time on all the external clocks should be a time that is earlier than 10:30 a.m. on that day, right? So let's say that he goes back 2 hours. Then his watch will say 10:30 a.m. when he gets out. But the external watches and all other observers will have the time indication shown of 8:30 a.m. Okay? So there has to be a discrepancy between the two time frames for this to actually be a case of time travel. But now we have what might seem to some people to be a paradox. Okay, so let me put that paradox up here. So here, paradox. How can the same two events be separated by two different amounts of time. That might seem impossible. Okay, so let's go with the future time travel scenario that I just mentioned. And so he got in at 10 a.m. On his watch, it said he spent 30 minutes in there. When he got out, his watch says 10:30. But let's say that all the external clocks say 12:30. So his watch, 10:30. External watches that are not on his body show 12:30. Okay, now question. How much time is in between when he got in the machine and when he got out? What do you think? And a little hint, it seems possible to give two different answers. But let's see what you think might be at least one of those answers. How much time in this description of a hypothetical was spent, or how much time passed between when he gets in and when he gets out? One answer one could give is that how much time is in between getting in and getting out. We're talking about arrival into the machine and then departure from the machine. You could say that there's how much amount of time in between getting in and out of that cylinder. So one way of looking at it is that there's a 2-hour and 30-minute gap. Correct. Because when he gets out, all the clocks everywhere say 10. And then people just watching the machine would see him get out 2.5 hours later. But it's also possible to perhaps think there's another answer that can be given to this question. 2 hours and 30 minutes is one way of looking at it, but you could also say that how much time was there in between getting in and out? Just want you to hit me with the second option for answering this question. 2 hours and 30, that's one of them. But yes, the other one's 30 minutes, correct? Because according to his watch, it was 30 minutes. And according to his experience, it was a half-hour experience, right? He could have been in there and just like watched an episode of Friends or something and then gets out of the machine. But when he gets out of the machine, it's a longer amount of time that everyone else external to him has experienced. So some people might say this looks to be like a paradox, something impossible. Two events can't be separated by two different intervals of time. Like what if you asked somebody, they said they took a flight. They flew from New York to California. And you're like, how long was your flight? And they said, oh yeah, well, it was 6 hours. It was also 2 hours. So that's how long it took. It doesn't make sense, right? You'd be like, what, are you losing your mind? Like, I mean, I asked you how long it took. You told me two different numbers, but there can only be one. So do we have a paradox here? Well, David Lewis says it might look like it, but actually we can explain this away. So he just introduces the concept of two different time frames. Okay, so one, personal time. Two, the other one, external time. So personal time is the time experienced by the individual time traveler as is shown on their personal wristwatch. So time as experienced. It's gonna be tough. I'm gonna have to move over here. Time as experienced by the individual person or the individual time traveler. External time is time as experienced and measured by all external observers and clocks. Time as measured by all external observers and clocks, so other people that are not the time traveler. So now, with the introduction of these two different types of time, we can eliminate the paradox that was mentioned. So let's see if you can kind of catch the drift here. The proper way now of explaining the appearing to be discrepancy between the two amounts of time is to say that it took 30 minutes of what for this person to emerge from the cylinder after they got in? It took 30 minutes of blank. What do you say? "30 minutes of," waiting for it. Yes, Jessica, of personal time, and William and Bridger, Nellie, and the rest. Yes, it's 30 minutes of personal time because according to his experience in the machine and on his wristwatch, it's indicating that that was a 30-minute span, but it was from external time. According to the space-time theory, this is an exactly predicted result. When one observer is moving through space at different velocity from another, time is dilating relative to that other motionless observer relative to the first. So we actually do all have our own individual personal time. Why is it that our personal time in real life always seems to coincide with external time? Because, as again, we don't have the means to achieve time travel or the means to achieve these greatly divergent variable speeds. And thus, it's kind of, I guess, a good happenstance for us that we're all able to be on the same page, in sync with our clocks. External and personal time for all of us agrees. So an hour of my time is the same as an hour of your time and everyone else's. But if time travel did exist, then by hypothesis, the experience of the time traveler would differ from the measured and observed experience of time by all others. So this then allows us to make sense of all kinds of initially contradictory sounding statements. Like if I had a time machine with me and I say to you right now, you know what, in about 10 minutes, I'm going to be back there in 1970, hanging out and watching some Vietnam War protests. That sounds like it's an impossible statement because it sounds like it's saying 10 minutes into the future, I'm going to be 50 years into the past. But now, with the introduction of these two different types of time, we can actually make sense of that statement. What it means is in 10 minutes of my personal time, so I'm going to experience 10 minutes of my own life, I will be minus 50 years in external time. So paradox explained away, one at least, that he thinks he can justifiably eliminate. So we go on. The next one has to do with imagining an interaction between a time traveler and themselves at a different part of time. Okay, so I'm going to erase here, and let's ask a new question and deal with the second paradox. Question. If a person talks to their past self, is this two people talking or one? And the reason this appears to be somewhat of a paradox is that both answers have some plausibility or some rational common sense behind them. So, okay, think about this scenario. Tomorrow they come out with the new Apple time machine. And you're like, wow, that's so cool. I actually want to go back in time. And I want to just kind of warn my younger self about the whole coronavirus thing so that they have a heads up or something. I don't know. You just want to tell them about it, or you want to tell them about something else so that they'll know in advance. So you make a little trip to the past. Maybe you go back to 2016 before you started being a student here at Chapman, and you're going to talk to your high school version of yourself and just have that chat about whatever, okay? Now, when you make the phone call to your past self, now that you've arrived back in 2016, you're dialing and they're receiving the call on the other end. How many people are having a conversation? Is this two or one? What do you think? It's okay to have either response because they both have some degree of common sense plausibility, but let's see what your intuition might be, or at least someone's intuition, whether it's yours or not. One might think that how many people are in this phone call? If you have a view, okay, so some of you guys are saying two. Now, why would one think that it's two? Well, because obviously they're in two different parts of space. And to all external observers, it would appear that's two individuals. It can't be one person if they're two different parts. One's calling, one's receiving the call. But, okay, guys, the other answer, though. Why do you think someone might say it's not two people having this conversation, just one? How could that be justified? What would be the reason for thinking that it's only one, not two people? It's not maybe two people, but two, what are they called? Let's see if you can come up with this. Same person, right, Caesar? But what are the two things having the conversation if they're not two people? They're two what? Let's see what you have to say about that. What are the two things having this conversation? If they are not two people, they're two something of one person. That's right, two temporal parts of the same individual. Right, exactly. So the future temporal part is communicating with the previous past temporal part. Let me show you a space-time diagram to give you a sense of what's going on in this scenario. Maybe a little bit of higher angle here. So that's depicted here on the time axis. And we get to 2020. The time machine comes out, and the person wants to make a trip back to 2016 and have that conversation with themselves. Now look, the space-time diagram starts with them just, getting older. But at 2020, there's a loop back, because the person decides to make that trip back. Now, prior to 2016, if you drew a cross-section through the space-time diagram, you'd only see one temporal part in the cross-section. But now, because the person has made a return trip to 2016, a cross-section drawn through that year would have two of their temporal parts, this one and then this one. But notice that it is the same zigzag pattern of the space-time diagram. It's just that it folds back in on itself as this turn in the space-time streak reverses back on itself. So because he goes back into the past, he locates a second temporal part of himself in space with the first one. Now, for each of us that are not going back into the past, or I guess the future, we're going to the future, but not jumping ahead like a time traveler would, we only have one temporal part of ourselves in the space-time universe at once. Like one of your temporal parts listening to this lecture, one of my temporal parts right now giving the lecture, but there's not another one running around out there unless there is a future time travel part of you that's come back and it's just not revealed themselves to you. But if there were time travel, then there would be co-location in space-time of two temporal parts at once. And suppose that if he goes back now to 2020, and then he says, wait, I forgot something. Like I left my cell phone back there. I want to go back and get it again. Then he'll make a second trip back, okay? And now there's going to be three temporal parts located in that part of 2016. So why would it be more reasonable to affirm that when the phone call happens, it's a call between two temporal parts of one person instead of saying completely two different people? Well, because when you have a conversation with a completely distinct individual, a different person from you, there's no psychological connection between you and that other person, meaning like you do not have memories of being that person at a previous point in time. But obviously, in this case, that is not so. Temporal part that's later on in the time sequence has psychological connectedness to the previous stages in that same series. Therefore, the psychological continuity among the different temporal parts makes it better for us to think of this as one person with two different temporal parts. And if this really did happen, it would make very vividly clear that these temporal parts are not to be thought of as something that's just a theoretical fiction, because there would actually be two of them there and you'd be able to just see the two different ones. Okay, so that's the second paradox explained away. It's not two people, it's two temporal parts of one person, and he justifies that with the psychological continuity justification that I just mentioned. So another paradox has been eliminated, he thinks. Okay, so now for the next paradox, I'll just kind of talk you through this one because it's a little bit elaborate to write each word out, but it's easy enough to understand. What he talks next about are closed causal loops. Loops of causation that could be caused if time travel happened, which seem to some to be utterly incomprehensible and impossible. So imagine this situation. Later tonight or tomorrow, whatever, you get a phone call. You don't really recognize the number, but you take the call. Suppose that on the other end, this person speaks to you, and they say this to you. They're like, hey, I need you to do something for me. It's very important, so don't ask why, but I need you to build something. And they tell you a very detailed blueprint for how to build some device. And so you're kind of a little bit shocked because you heard this lecture earlier in the day and you're like, it's really playing out the way that the lecture went. But anyway, you're kind of shocked, so you decide to build the thing. You do construct it based on the instructions given over the phone. And what it ends up being is a time machine. Wow. So you got a time machine on your hands now that you built based on instructions you received over the phone. You let it collect dust in the garage for a while, looking at it, wondering if you should ever touch it. But let's say time passes, you finish Chapman, now it's 2025, and you go into the garage and you're like, you know what, let me fire this thing up and take it for a spin and see what really happens. So you turn on the time machine and it sends you back to 2020. And now you're back in 2020, this future self of you, and you decide to do something. What do you think is the next step in this little science fiction story? You got the phone call from a mysterious caller. They told you how to build a time machine. You sat with it and waited 5 years, took a trip back to 2020. Now you're back in 2020 again. And what do you think the person's trying to do next? Having arrived in 2020 from 2025, the person decides to do what? You decide in this case to do what? What do you think? All the pieces are there. You guys, I know you watch movies and stuff. Okay, good. So you're going to now call your past self and you're going to relay the directions about how to build a machine so that they'll be able to build it and that this will occur. So you do so. You pass that information on to your younger self. Mission accomplished. You go back to 2025 and do whatever you were going to do there. Now, there's some deep puzzles, though, about this whole scenario, right? How did you learn how to build a machine? Well, because you got a phone call and someone told you. How did you know how to give the instructions? Because you remembered the instructions that were given to you initially. But where did the information come from in the first place? It seems like it's literally just kind of come out of nowhere because it was only determined from having heard the testimony of your future self. But the future self only knew because when they were the past self, they received the testimony of their future counterpart. So that might seem to some people to be like a total inexplicable paradox, because the loop kind of goes in a circle and there's no explanation for why the whole loop exists. If anybody watches that movie Time Crimes that I was going to designate for lectures this week, it definitely goes into such scenarios as that. Very clever movie. David Lewis's way of replying to that paradox is, I don't know if it's his best response of all, but what he says is it definitely is weird and bizarre, but it's no more weird and bizarre than other things that we already have to accept about the universe. Like, for example, has the universe always existed, or did it start existing at some point in time? Oh, hey, latest episode of Rick and Morty, are you talking about the anime version one, or is there a new one, the new 5? Or are you talking about the ones that they released last fall? Did they just drop another one? You'll let me know. But anyway, I'm a big fan, so... in the closed causal loop scenario, it seems inexplicable. But he says, look, what about the universe that exists? Did it come from nothing or did it come from something? If it came from nothing, then that doesn't make much sense. That's kind of bizarre and inexplicable because something can't come from nothing. On the other hand, if it's always been there and there's no origin at all, then that seems bizarre as well. How can something exist that never even had to start existing? But we know the universe exists. Or if you say God, right? Maybe God's the explanation for everything. Well, how does God exist having no cause or having no antecedent predecessor? So he thinks that the closed causal loops of time travel scenarios are no more or less weird than other things about reality that we already recognize as pretty strange. You're talking about the Christmas one with time travel from last year. Okay, yes, I remember that episode. I've seen all of them, so it's a great show. I'll talk to you about this loop thing. The parts of the loop are explicable, but the whole thing is not. Strange, but not impossible, and not too different from inexplicabilities that we're already used to. Almost everyone agrees that God or the Big Bang or the infinite past of the universe is inexplicable or uncaused. So if these are possible, why not also the inexplicable causal loops that arise in time travel scenarios like that? So there you go, in that way of replying to another paradox. Now there's just one last that I wanted to briefly touch on, but we're coming close to the end of our time today. So I'll summarize more of it next meeting at the beginning with about 5 minutes of intro time to the next lecture, but I'll just sort of anticipate and preview it for you here. The next question is raised: can a person alter events if they went into the past? He gives a scenario of a person who we say is Tim. Tim hates his grandfather. Who knows why, but he just hates this man with a passion. And what he wants to do is actually kill his own grandfather. But there's a little problem, and the problem is that his grandfather's already dead of natural causes. So why does he want to kill a man that's already died of natural causes? I don't know. He hates him that much. So what he would like to do instead is murder his grandfather so that he didn't die of natural causes and be the cause of his death. So he inherited a bunch of wealth from this grandfather, and he turned that wealth into building a time machine so that he could, conduct this weird mission of wanting to kill a grandfather in the past. So he built the time machine using the inherited wealth. He's now going back to 1950 when his grandfather was in his prime, and he's going to try and take him out back in 1950. But here's the thing. The grandfather met the grandmother years after that. And then when they conceived a child that would eventually become a parent of Tim, that all happened subsequent to 1950. So if he goes back to 1950, fully motivated and armed and ready to kill his grandfather, here's the question. Can he succeed, or will it be impossible for him to succeed? Now, it seems like both answers are somewhat reasonable. And yet again, this is supposed to be the paradox, that it seems possible for him to kill the grandfather, but also, if you think about it, it seems like it should be impossible. For the first intuition that it's possible, that's just based on the idea that if he goes to the past, he's there, he's armed, he's got the means and motive. So basically, what's to stop him? It seems like he should be able to. But the other answer comes when you just think about the bigger picture. Why do you figure it would be impossible maybe for him to actually do this? Why do you think maybe, despite his best efforts, he will not successfully assassinate his grandfather in 1950? Why might somebody think that this is in fact not something that could happen? Why do you think? Because you could argue that, right? You could think, well, he could go back to the past, but he's not going to actually be able to kill his grandfather in 1950, because why would that perhaps be impossible? And then we close with that, if anybody has a comment. Because if he did kill his grandfather, it would be a contradiction, because then he never would have been born and his father would not have existed. So of course he has to exist and have been born to make a travel to the past, and he has traveled to the past, so it means he was born. Therefore, anything that would contradict his birth seems to be an impossible outcome. Just think of your own birth. You're watching this lecture, so you were definitely born. Don't you think it's inconceivable that something could cancel your birth? I mean, maybe you could stop existing now, and that would be tragic, but you've already been born, so it's too late to make it so that you never were born. So he's basically, Lewis is going to go with that interpretation. He says, try as he might, Tim's going to fail, but it's going to be for some basic reason. His gun is going to jam, or his grandfather is going to be missing from the scene at the critical time. But whatever does happen, it won't lead to the death of the grandfather, because that would be a contradiction in the timeline of history. It would both include the birth of the grandson and also the never having been born of the grandson. And those two things cannot both exist in one consistent universe. So there's a little more to say, but that's pretty much, the majority of all the notes on time. So I'm going to give you guys your study, not study guide, but your prompts for the next essay over the weekend. We'll talk about it on Monday. There's going to be 3 different optional topics for you to write on, and then you'll have a couple weeks to work on it, just like the first essay. So for now, anyways, guys, have a great weekend. Hope you're really doing well and staying safe, healthy, and everything else. Good to see you guys. Take care, and let's be in touch, and I'll see you guys back on Monday. And as always, if anyone had questions, comments, or anything they need, do let me know, and I'm always checking my messages, okay? So thank you, guys. Bye-bye.